Hi, I'm John DeDakis. I'm a novelist, a manuscript editor, a writing coach, and a former editor on CNN's The Situation Room with Wolf Blitzer. You're one-to-one with me, and I'm one-to-one with, let me bring him on here, Bill Rapp. There he is, former CIA official and spy writer, spy novelist. It was Cold War spy novelist. I think that's probably the best way to put it. Welcome, Bill. Good to see you.
Yeah. Thanks, John. Thanks. It's great to be here.
Okay, good. Well, we had some technical difficulties, so we're getting a late start, but that's okay because most people will probably be watching once we archive this thing. So, lots to talk about. And the first thing I want to talk about is your most recent novel. Let me put it on the stage there. Let's get a closer look at it. The Prague Spring. And this takes place in 1968 in Prague during the I guess a democratization that didn't turn out so well. So talk about that. Talk about the story, and then I've got a few follow-ups, I'm sure.
Okay, sure. Yeah, the Prague Spring. Actually, I stole that title because that's how people refer to it. Historians and the people at the time referred to the reform efforts of Alexander Dubček, who was the party general secretary, leader of Czechoslovakia, as it was at the time, where they tried to create what they called socialism with a human face, and the Stalinist approach of years past, and the leadership that preceded Dubček when he was appointed to his post in January of '68. And almost immediately, they started opening up press freedoms, media freedoms, literary freedoms. They celebrated Franz Kafka as a national hero. He had been sort of held in hiding. They were ashamed of him, I guess, too bourgeois. And they even started talking about open elections and, opening up the borders and this sort of thing. And of course, that did not go that well in Moscow, nor in other Stalinist capitals like East Berlin, Warsaw at the time, and so that was there was a lot of hope, a lot of excitement, and I tried to capture some of that in this book. The series has the same protagonist throughout. Karl Bayer. He's currently in this episode. He's the chief of station of the basically running the CIA office in Prague, and his challenge, of course, is to find out how far the Prague Spring can go. Who are his allies in the Prague government that he can talk to find out what the prospects for continued success are, but also what he's picking up about how Moscow and the other Stalinist capitals may react. And he gets there the previous summer. That's usually when the CIA stations change their leadership. And throughout the spring and the summer of '68 is when things really get hot in terms of the reform efforts, and also the pressure from Moscow. And Bayer's job is to keep track of this and let Washington know what he's hearing from his sources as to how this might turn out, the Prague Spring, and the repercussions it might have in Eastern Europe. As you can imagine, there was a lot of optimism, a lot of hope that this would succeed. It didn't, of course, and Bayer's there when the Soviets invade in August, and has to smuggle out his family, the other folks in the station in the embassy, the contacts that he had built up with people that now were worried about their future and their lives, actually. And that's basically what goes on in this story. And there's a great deal of uncertainty throughout, and he has to deal with this not only in terms of what's going to happen in Prague, but what's going to happen to the people he was working with.
Were you ever posted in Prague?
No, I was not. I visited Prague numerous times. And in fact, the first time I went there was in the early '70s. I was spending a year at the University of Innsbruck. And a friend and I thought we could just hitchhike into Prague. We were 19 and naive. We got as far as the Austro-Czechoslovak border. And what surprised me was that the Austrian guards and the Czechoslovak border guards would host each other for coffee and beer periodically. And the Czechoslovak guards promised us they would ask truck drivers if they could take us. That didn't work. So we got a ride to the train station just over the border, took the train into Prague. Uh, Maybe it's just my memory. It seemed very gray and dismal, overcast. It was early December. But then I went back. My wife and I went back because we were stationed in Berlin. When the wall fell and Germany reunified, and
Mhm.
things opened up, and Prague immediately threw its doors open to visitors. But they didn't really have the infrastructure, so we drove down to Prague from Berlin, and we had to. You found people that would rent out basement rooms to you. Since the hotels couldn't cope with the surge of visitors, which was very interesting to see how things were changing. Then I went back, I think once or twice for work. And then most recently, last November, my daughter was there, my younger daughter. She was on R&R from her assignment in Africa, and I joined her in Prague. And this was after I'd finished the early draft of this novel, so I could check on a lot of the scenery and whatnot, and make some badly needed corrections. It seems up.
Uh-huh.
So I've had a not a long period, and as I mentioned in the acknowledgments, there was a colleague at work who had lived in Prague and served there, and he was able to correct me as well on a couple of things when he looked at an early draft of the manuscript. So
I mean, my wife has been to Prague and I haven't, and I'd love to go, but she said that it wasn't really seriously damaged during World War II and that it's just a gem.
yeah, that's correct. My understanding, there was some bombing. I think we Americans bombed it by mistake once. We wanted to bomb, I think, Hanover or something, and got lost, that's a hell of a long distance to get lost. And there was a little bit of fighting, but not very much. And I think the German commander agreed to declare it an open city to avoid that. And I had a professor in grad school when I was at the University of Toronto, and he was he was Czech, and he said in the summer you always saw Prague full of Germans because it was one place they could go to see what an older German city used to look like. And
Yeah.
so it was. It's a lovely town. Great beer, good food.
Did that experience when you got that close to it at so close to the Prague Spring, did that whet your appetite to get into the CIA? Did you know that was what you were going to do with your life?
No, not at the time. Nothing that specific, but that year in Innsbruck, as I tell people, was an eye opener for me. I was a sophomore in college, and it was my first real experience spending a lot of time overseas, and living in another culture and learning a different language. And I found that very appealing. And I think that sort of steered me towards a career and an adult life where I would be involved somehow in that kind of work and what was going on. For a number of reasons, I ended up at the CIA. I did take the Foreign Service exam, was put on the waiting list, for what they call the political cone. But the CIA called first, and that worked out just fine with me. I never looked back.
Did you consult with anyone who was there in 1968? I mean, are there any people who were CIA officials at the time who you were able to use as sources?
No, that's so long ago. I don't, in fact, I didn't even try. I did ask that one colleague if he knew of anybody who had served there, and he said, "Nah, they weren't around anymore." However, I did go to speak with one of my former professors not, he wasn't my professor. He was a professor I got to know at Notre Dame, who specialized in Eastern Europe, East Germany in particular. But he recommended a couple memoirs for me for that period. And one in particular was very helpful in charting a lot of the maneuvering and dynamics within the Czechoslovak government in Prague.
Yeah. Based on your experience within the CIA and your, I don't know, being an American looking at what's going on right now, are there parallels between Prague in 1968 and the United States of America in 2026?
I've never actually thought about that part, about parallels to Prague 68. And I have to confess, as a historian, I tend to be very cautious in looking at parallels because there's always as many dissimilarities as there are parallels. I think any kind of parallel I might draw would really be a stretch. I think we were handcuffed at the time, as was also apparent in '56 in Budapest, as to what we could do on the ground. At best, we could try and and you really didn't have the opportunity to create a sort of a diplomatic alliance and support either for what was going on in Prague. Because, of course, if you get too close to a reform effort, it could seem tainted. And I remember when I was talking with some communists as a student in Berlin, they were convinced that the whole Prague Spring thing was a CIA plot, a covert operation. And you say, oh, that's crazy. But I'm sure there were people in Moscow and elsewhere in the Warsaw Pact who had that kind of views, which really limits. Do you want to offer too much support that you end up tainting, the efforts? Because there was plenty of domestic support for what was going on in Prague that I think
remember
they're real dangerous.
When I was in the Army, I had a chance to get into East Berlin. We were allowed to go in, but we had to be in uniform. And I remember talking to an East German East Berliner on the street, and I asked him, "Why is the wall there?" And he said, "To keep the criminals out."
Yeah, they used to refer to it. The East German phrase for it was, I think it was the Antifaschistische Schutzmauer, the anti-fascist protective wall. And I mean, that's how, so I don't know how many East Germans actually believed that or accepted that, but that was the official logic for it. Yeah.
Well, and that's the big lie. And you could argue that the current administration specializes in big lies.
Yeah, I have to move cautiously there, John. Again, okay. I think, yeah, they do have a credibility problem. I agree. I think you can say that.
You're very diplomatic, sir. I am going to do my best to try to ask questions that I think a lot of people have about the CIA and don't often get a chance to talk with someone who was there, who was behind the scenes. Now, I know there's a lot you can't talk about, and I'm certainly not trying to do a gotcha interview, but I'm going to do my best to push the envelope to get you to help us understand better about the process of intelligence gathering and making decisions about an adversary. And I mean, we have just started a preemptive war in Iran. This we're live right now in March of 2026. Obviously, this conversation will be archived and live in infamy. So we'll have a chance to look back on things. But look, you've been a CIA analyst. You used to brief Condoleezza Rice when she was National Security Advisor. So you have chops when it comes to analyzing politics and geopolitical situations, military situations, based on your reading of how this war has been going. Is there anything you can infer about how well planned this particular operation was when we started going after Iran?
Yeah, let me start by putting the caveat out there, which I think you and others would recognize, is that since I'm no longer working there and I'm no longer a party to or even hear about conversations and the policy making, obviously I'm not seeing the intelligence reporting that they would draw on that. So I have to rely on the press that I read. When I do try and keep up, I mean, that's just a habit. You don't walk away cold turkey. So I'll get the New York Times every morning. I get the Economist and the New Yorker during the week, and every month the Atlantic, to try and read and keep up. And I would just say I share the conclusion that a lot of people have come to. The complaint they made about this operation appears to have been planned pretty thoroughly militarily, but without the strategic context that one requires to make it effective. And I think I get the impression that they haven't really thought through a lot of the repercussions. And oh yeah, my wife just told me I also read the Cipher Brief every day.
What's that?
That's a daily that's put together. It's a sort of a press summary of national security issues. and it goes around. It sort of stays within the National Security and Foreign Policy Network, and they have a lot of experts that they have that they pick up, former military, diplomatic, and intelligence officers. I've written a number of articles there and done some book reviews, and they've reviewed actually some of my Cold War spy novels as well. So it's
is that information classified?
No, it's not. It's an unclassified document, and I would recommend it if you want to. It keeps up. It recovers a lot of things that you might already see either in the television media or in the press, but it covers the globe, and it will raise up some other things that you haven't heard of or heard about, and some of the commentary I think can be very helpful, and it'll be.
And it's what is
like,
it again?
General Petraeus.
It's called the Cipher.
It's called the Cipher Brief. CIPHER. Brief. Yeah.
Brief. And is it like .com, or how would you get it?
Well, I get it online. I think I'm sure I don't think there's a hard copy that's done. So I would just Google Cipher Brief, and you should be able to subscribe to it.
Okay. Let me. I'm gonna go ahead.
So I just to get back to the story about that what appears to have happened was that they assume, like, and they're not unique in this administration. Past administrations have done the same thing. They seem to assume that a military effort will get you what you want. Once you bomb the heck out of something, people are just going to throw up their hands and say, "Oh, okay, what do you want us to do?" And it doesn't always work that way. And even boots on the ground don't always stop it, as we found out in the second war in Iraq. So I think that appears to be where they're really scrambling right now. And frankly, they haven't done a very good job in building an alliance, a network. You look at the first Bush, the administration, number 41, he did one hell of a job in pulling together an alliance to kick Saddam out of Kuwait. And frankly, I think the Biden administration did a great job in pulling together an alliance to support Ukraine, to resist Russian aggression. I think you're seeing it now in the Europeans. They did. I mean, the only time Article 5 has been invoked by NATO was to support the U.S. after the 9/11 bombings. And they were with us in Iraq and Afghanistan. And this administration appears uninformed about that. And I think they've been really insulted our European partners, like the Danes, that lost more people per capita than anyone else. And they removed the flags in front of the U.S. Embassy in Denmark, which had been there in honor of that effort. So I think, it's going to take more to get them on board to support a war that they didn't really consider a very wise decision in the first place.
All right, you mentioned.
I'd say that not knowing, I don't know. Maybe a lot of this stuff was discussed. Maybe they do have plans in place. I wouldn't know. So
okay. Now
you take that for what it's worth.
Okay, fair enough. You mentioned Iraq, and you were one of Condi Rice's briefers for the President's Daily Brief. And was this before the Iraq War, during the first the Iraq preemptive war?
It was before, it was the buildup, and it was during the war and the invasion. Yeah.
So
early 2000s. Yeah.
All right. So we know now that there weren't any weapons of mass destruction, right?
That's correct. That's correct.
How did that happen? How did we? How did we get it wrong?
There were a lot of retrospective work done at the agency afterwards, and that's one thing we do. We did when I was there, and in fact, I led some of that effort after I retired and was working as a consultant at the agency. You looked at past operations and analytic programs, and there was a lot of time was spent on how we got the Iraqi WMD thing so wrong. And I think the conclusion was that we ended up making the faulty assumptions based on what had been there before. And this is something you have to be very careful about as analysts, because they had such an extensive WMD program before the first Iraq war, and when they went into Kuwait, the assumption was that and Saddam did that to sort of as an enabler to empower him as a regional player. So the assumption was that he must continue to do that because objectives are the same, and he's trying to recover from the defeat in the first Iraq war. As it turns out, and he was trying to hide information, and the assumption being, well, he's hiding it because he's got him. He's still, the program is alive. Um, I remember once I went in and showed a report on something like that to Steve Hadley, who was kind of his deputy, and he said, "Well, we got to put together a folder that includes all the reports of what they're doing here to hide their programs." And it was a pretty thick folder. Of course, the assumption was that we didn't realize that we should have turned the assumption on its head, and he was doing that to hide the fact that he didn't have the WMD because he wanted to keep people worried about it, try and gain some benefit from the uncertainty. And since then, I know afterwards, we really focused on alternative scenarios, explaining what those might be, what would lead up to them, what to look for. And when I did some liaison training overseas, that was always, we spent a couple of days working with other services to make sure they develop programs to keep an open mind on things. And one time it was one country, and I was saying how, okay, we need to look at an alternative to what Putin might change his mind and his policies in Ukraine. And they said, well, he's not going to know it. I said, no, look, that's what got people in trouble when they talked about the fall of the wall. It'll never happen. Moscow will never. Well, but it did happen. So I said, you got to be prepared. You got to look at all the different scenarios. So, and then we had programs where we'd go through how you would try and assemble those together and figure out where might be the outlier. When are they going to turn and try something different?
The reports were when during Trump's first term, that he really didn't pay attention to his daily briefing. Did you hear that from other people that that are still in the agency? Is that true that he's
No, I did. I heard that, but I can't really nail it down to an authoritative source. I don't know. I understand from what I heard is he really liked graphics, pictures. He didn't like to read. But I was never there. I didn't talk to anybody who was in the room, so I can't say for certain that was the case.
Okay, I have another question about Trump, and again, I appreciate your willingness to let me try as mightily as I can to get a better handle on this. And I don't know the answer to this question, but I'll phrase it this way: as near as you can tell, based on your experience within the CIA and the people that you know, is Donald Trump a Russian asset, a useful idiot, both, or neither?
I don't know. People have talked about that. People have written assessments to try and nail that down. I think I would be uncomfortable saying he's this or that. I would just say that I think he has a mistaken impression of Putin, and I think he evaluates Putin in terms of his own experiences. Like he would make a deal. And I don't think he realizes that Putin's not interested in a deal. Putin's interested in restoring the empire of the czars. And he's willing to make whatever sacrifices necessary. He's not going to be pulled into a deal or negotiations that would benefit him or Russia economically. He has a different order.
It would seem as though it would seem as though Trump is more interested in hegemony, sort of, power in the hemispheric power and influence.
Yeah, I think he's. My impression is, and again, I don't know that much about the man. I know, his public persona. My impression is he's very taken with the turn of the 19th to the 20th century, when the United States became an imperial power, primarily from the Spanish-American War. And I think, and he also sees that as a period when, America became a world industrial and commercial power as well. My reading of history would suggest to me that he has a mistaken impression as what caused it, what the context was for that evolution. So I don't know. I hope his advisors can help enlighten them, give them, I think, a more thorough understanding of the history of the period. But that's just an impression I have from some of my readings. Like,
do you have a sense of how this Iran situation is going to end? Is there an end game? I mean, there's
well,
talk now about giving Iran 5 days to reach a deal to open the Strait of Hormuz, and will hold off on committing a war crime of bombing their civilian infrastructure.
yeah,
Um,
I was talking to a neighbor a couple weeks ago, and he said, "Well, give me your worst case scenario." And I said, "Oh boy." Uh, I shudder to think of the worst case scenario. I think the scenario that is a bad scenario is one where we pull back from our military effort, sort of like we did in Vietnam, declare victory and get out, without achieving the strategic objectives, which we may have. I don't know. It hasn't been very clearly defined. So, and so we'll have done all this, and it really won't help. We'll be no better off than we were before, I think.
mm,
I'm afraid that that's what's going to happen, and it'll take years for the global economy to correct itself and restore, I think, the prosperity that had existed. That's my concern. I just don't think that we have the resources or the will to pursue this, for forever, in an open-ended sort of military operation.
Yeah, I want to go to we have some comments. People are asking questions, and I'm going to take one. Helen Thornton Gussie asks, "How much can you, as an ex-CIA analyst, write about before you are breaking non-disclosure agreements?"
That's a good question. That's one I often get. Everything I write has to go to the Publications Review Board at the agency, and that's everything. I also have a private eye series set in the Chicago area. I have to submit those as well. The benefit that I've had, or the advantage I've had in writing a series set during the Cold War, is the material so dated that there's really no danger. I get my responses in 2 to 3 weeks for the Publication Review Board. If I was to write about, say, the current, military effort in Iran, that would get hung up for quite a while. Because even if you're not speaking officially on behalf of the CIA, you appear to be endorsing certain positions, and that they get a little hairy about that. So I think that's not a problem I've had in the past, and because I'm not dealing with any real sources and methods or operations. There is a certain authentic element to those stories, I think, because they're set during real historical crises, like the Prague Spring,
Right.
like the Budapest, the Hungarian revolt and the Soviet invasion there in '56. So I think, but again, that's just so dated, and I'm not drawing on any. I have some real people in there. Bob McNamara shows up in the Simon in Saigon, and a lot of the ambassadors I've had by or working with were real ambassadors. But I researched those individuals, and I think I'm not trying to, belittle anybody's efforts or reputation or anything, and in fact, Shirley Temple Black shows up in the Prague Spring. So,
Yeah.
And again,
didn't she become
there.
ambassador? She became an ambassador over there, right?
Yes, she did. Yes, she did. And she was there during the Soviet invasion. She had gone there as she had a UN position. I forget the exact title, but she had gone there to sort of see what was going on and talk to people about the Prague Spring. She's there when the Soviets come rumbling in, and she led one of the groups, one of the cavalcades of people that were left from the embassy to flee Czechoslovakia. So, and again, I had no reason to say anything bad or to glorify her role. I just tried to portray it as realistically as possible.
Okay. Helen has a follow-up question. She asks, authors who haven't been in the CIA will write what they think is the truth, whereas the truth. Does that make sense? Does that, is there a
Yeah, I think
difference
that's
between your authenticity and someone who's making it up?
Yeah, I try to, and in fact, I checked with that fella, the colleague who had been in Prague, who read it, and I said, I just want to make sure, operationally, I'm not being too fanciful here or belittling anything, And he says, no, you're good there. You're on solid ground there. And I think, I did have a lot of experience with colleagues in the operations directorate, but I think that's fair. One of the things that I think they really mislead is they seem to think there's a lot of backstabbing and double dealing and whatnot. The agency, people are really committed to the mission and to the Constitution. And there's a tremendous esprit de corps in that building. And one of the things that I and my wife, who also worked there, miss is a lot of the people we worked with. And I really enjoyed that after I retired, going back as consultant, still walking the halls, running into former colleagues and people who had worked for me who seemed happy to see me. And they would often, tell me quite openly about what they were working on and whatnot. And so I think that is often missing in a lot of these works.
Okay. Well, the book is The Prague Spring. I want to keep talking because you've written a lot. In fact, I think what I want to do is this is a very low key, low budget operation. So it's gonna take me just a second, because what I want to do is I want to go to show your books on Amazon, and because I'm going to probably, if I try to show them one at a time, I'll get them out of order and really mess it up. So take us through what we're seeing on the screen there.
Sure. The first book is a Turkish Triangle. That's, I think, the fifth book in the Cold War series. And it's the fall of 1962 during the Cuban Missile Crisis. And Bayer has to go to Istanbul, or to Ankara, really, and then he spends time in Istanbul as well, to investigate the deaths of 3 Soviet assets during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Because people may not realize it, but Turkey played an integral role in that crisis. I mean, the compromise we reached with the Soviets was to pull our Pershing missiles out of Italy and Turkey. In exchange for them to pull their missiles out of their medium-range ballistic missiles out of Cuba. And for some reason, Khrushchev agreed not to publicize that compromise, which is kind of strange. But in any case, Bayer finds himself in the middle of all this maneuvering with the Soviets in Turkey at this time. The next book there is Angel in Black. That's one of the private eye novels. The first private eye novel. When I was in graduate school, I read a lot of mysteries as just a relief from reading all the history books, And I just fell in love with Raymond Chandler, Ross MacDonald, a lot of those artists. And so Angel in Black was written in that vein. In fact, the whole series my publisher at the time referred to it as suburban noir, because it takes place in the town I grew up in Naperville, which is a suburb of Chicago, but you have to work in. I mean, how do you resist not working Chicago in, And so that's in there as well.
Okay.
The next book is
Saigon.
Saigon. That's the sixth book in the series, and it's the summer of '64 as we're getting ready to Americanize the war effort. Bayer, who has had what we call a 7th floor job. The 7th floor is the top floor of the agency building. It's where most of the senior level management works. So people are always talking about 7th floor this and 7th floor that. It's where my wife worked as the chief of staff for Gina Haspel when she was the director. And Assignment in Saigon he's sent there to investigate reports because it's become such a contentious issue in Washington in debates. And the director says, I need to be better prepared. So I want you to go out and talk to people and give me your assessment. Of course, he gets pulled into some operational things as well, faces a couple of assassination attempts. Tears of Innocence, the next book, is the first book in the Cold War spy series. Carl Bayer is part of military intelligence. He's sent as part of Operation Paperclip to work in Berlin in the immediate months right after the war. And I remember when I mentioned that I wanted to write a book set in Berlin right after the war, but I had an opening scene, but I didn't really have a character or storyline. And she says, well, why don't you use my father's story? He was sent there after the war for as part of Operation Paperclip, moved into a German's house, had the same name, exact same spelling. Guy didn't come back from the Eastern Front ever. And I thought, well, that's could be an interesting point of departure. And so that gets him involved with a number of things. He meets the man's wife, becomes attracted to her, well, I won't say any more, but he gets pulled into a number of adventures, but he ends up joining the newly formed CIA at the end of the book in 1947. Mm-hmm. Next one is Budapest Escape. That's the third book in the series, and that's when Karl Bayer he's running a high-level asset in the Hungarian government. 1956, he's working out of Vienna, and as we didn't have people stationed behind the Iron Curtain in the early years of the Cold War. And the Hungarians revolt against Soviet rule. The Soviets invade, and Bayer says, "I got to get my guy out of there." So he has to sneak into Budapest and sneak the man out. And in the meantime, his wife is arrested. If I give that part away, spoiler alert, he marries the woman he meets in Berlin, the widow of the other Karl Bayer, who does return from the Eastern Front, but doesn't live for very long. Her family's in East Germany. She tries to get them out, and they're arrested. And so she is transferred to Budapest, and Bayer has to get her out as well. Berlin Walls is the fourth book in the series, and that's set in Berlin in August 1961 as the wall's going up. He has to exfiltrate a KGB defector, and he gets there just as the wall is going up, which creates all sorts of additional problems. Plus, he has to sneak his wife's family out as well as the wall's going up.
Okay. I guess we've seen these before. Yeah. Habsburg Variation.
Oh, the Habsburg Variation is the second book in the series. Karl Bayer is working in Vienna, and it's on the eve of the signing of the State Treaty in 1955, which ended the occupation of Austria, returned the country to its sovereignty. He gets pulled into a murder investigation of an Austrian aristocrat, former Wehrmacht officer, that whole investigation gets him crosswise with the Soviets, with Washington, and with the Austrians. So he has to maneuver his way through that. And the interesting story there is we were living in London, and I had just submitted that manuscript to a previous publisher. They said, we're not doing any more mysteries and thrillers. We're only doing Western frontier fiction. I don't know, John, if you ever knew Five Star Publishers.
No.
They're out of business now. But I went off to Vienna. My wife said, you better go to Vienna because it's been a while since you've been there. So I'm getting on the plane, and I get this email. I'm like, oh, God, what am I going to do now? I did find the current publisher I have. And when they read this manuscript, they said, oh, well, let's make this a series because we want to offer you a contract for more than one book. And I said, okay, we got ourselves a Cold War series. Nice. And so it's and I did have to make, like with Prague, make a lot of corrections to the scenes. Yeah. Here, the others is this last book on this row is the second book in the Private Eye series, Pale Rain. That's, the Chicago area has developed beyond the capacity of the aquifers to sustain the region. So they have to import water from Lake Michigan. And I thought, this is kind of what's the movie with Jack Nicholson on the water in California?
I'm not sure.
Yeah, I forget. Anyway, I thought, this would make a good, background for a story like that. So that gets Bill Haberman, the detective, gets involved with the mob who want to control the pumping of Lake Michigan water to the western suburbs, and the FBI, who are after the mob guy who had hired Bayer to find his son's killer. Burning Altars is the third book in that series. That's back in 1922, the Catholic Church here in Naperville was burned down to the ground. Rumor always had it was the Ku Klux Klan. That was never proven, but I thought it still would make create the conditions for a good detective series because some guy shows up in Bayer's office and said, my great-grandfather was the guy who was put in prison for burning that church. He didn't do it, and the reward money is still out there. So you got to help me find it because my family deserves it because our great grandfather was put in jail. So that's that story. The middle one, Berlin Breakdown, was my first attempt at writing a novel. It's set during the fall of the wall, which I was stationed in Berlin during that. And it's it's been so long. Berlin Breakdown. It's he gets crosswise with the Stasi, as I recall, and the Soviets over some materials that they need to find that was allegedly would explain what the East Germans were up to and their plans to suppress the popular revolt that was brewing in East Berlin in East Germany. And he tries to find out what's going on. He's actually a State Department officer because my assignment in Berlin, I was seconded to the State Department. And so I thought I would use that. They say, write what you know.
Right,
so that's what I knew at the time. So that's what I used.
Well, and I was at CNN in Atlanta at the time the wall fell. And I remember when the wall went up. I was about 10 years old, and it was stunning. And I can remember JFK went to Berlin and gave the speech, let the, if we don't have to keep a wall up to, keep our people in, that's, it was a, what was it like to be there at the time? Was it emotional for you?
Oh yeah. My area of expertise when I got my PhD was European history and with a focus on Germany. And I told people I would be forever grateful to my employer that I was able to experience such a seminal event in German and European history personally. I worked very closely with the U.S. minister who we didn't have an embassy over there. Of course, the embassy was in Bonn to West Germany. We had an embassy in East Berlin, but we weren't a part of that. The U.S. mission in West Berlin, there are only like 4 or so missions in the world. There's the UN mission to New York, and there's one in Geneva, and I think one in Vienna as well. And it's so we had the U.S. mission in West Berlin. The minister there, I knew from working with him in Washington. Since I was fluent in German and had such an extensive German background, he would use me all the time going to these meetings. So, and he'd go to these meetings and he would give me his notes, or I'd take my own notes, and he'd say, let's write this up. We got to get this back to Washington. So I was right in the middle of it and sending it back. The story that I tell people, though, is we were watching my wife and I were sitting there watching what was going on TV. And she says, you better get down to the wall there and check this out, Said she had a really nice camera, beautiful camera, So I took that with me and I rode down on the subway. And of course, the closer you got to the center of town and where the wall was, the more crowded the subway got and the trains. But it was just amazing that whole weekend. But, so I went around, I took some pictures and whatnot, and I got on the subway to come home. And I was jostled so much that the lens came off and exposed all the film inside there. So, but we had, it was just astonishing to see all the East Berliners just lined up, and they would just, every East German who went to West Germany, once a year they would get 100 Deutschmarks in what was called Begrüßungsgeld, welcoming money. And they were just marveling at what was available in the stores, and they were just buying anything they could. I'll try that, because nobody knew how long it was going to stay open. And that next day, there was like, excuse me, that weekend, we were driving around, and the lines of East Berliners and other Germans coming out of the banks where they would go to get their Begrüßungsgeld, coming out of the banks and just going for block after block after block around the street. So many people, it was just astonishing. So
it's a lifelong memory. You'll never forget it.
Yeah. And the thing that got me too is it all just moved so fast. I mean, the house of cards just came shuffling down so rapidly. I never knew what the headlines were going to say on the morning paper when I picked it up. Right. It was just astonishing.
Talk about the writing process. Obviously, you've written so much. I mean, that gives me the impression that you're in your little writing grotto all the time, nose to the grindstone. You never come up for air. What's it like being a Cold War spy novelist?
Well, I think we probably discussed this at some of the writers' conferences. I'm a pantser, not a plotter. So
Explain that.
I just go in. Well, that's it. A lot of people will do outline a plot. I think probably a majority of writers do that, and I can see the benefit of that. And some swear by it, and they use it differently. For instance, who is it? The very successful novelist, shows up at a lot of the C3 conferences. Good friend of Austin, Jeffrey Deaver.
Right,
I
Jeff
think
Deaver. He
is it
outlines
now?
it
Yeah.
meticulously.
Oh yeah, he'll revise his outline like 10 or 15 times, and he'll have like 150 pages of an
Yeah.
outline. And it's like, all you got to do is just flesh it out eventually. I can't do that. I just prefer, I'm what's called a pantser, meaning I write by the seat of my pants. And there's others who do that. And I like that because I think the process is more organic. And I could, and I
But doesn't
have,
it feel like you're spinning your wheels? I mean, how do you get a plot out of something that's just sort of,
well, there
skidding
I've been
along?
fortunate because many a morning when I've gone into the room to write, and I think to myself, the hell am I going to do now? I mean, I'm sort of at this point. I have no idea. But once I start writing, somehow the characters take over and they seem to suggest things, and one thing leads to another. And I usually come away with something. In fact, I've gone back to the Private Eye series right now, and I'm just about finished with the first draft. And initially, I thought I'm only going to get about 40,000 words here, 50,000 tops.
Mhm.
I'm now at about 64,000. So, and I'm getting ready to close out the first draft. I mean, I'll have to do some more, obviously, get some more in there. But I'm always surprised that somehow it comes off, And I never know when I start a book how it's going to end.
Huh.
I mean, that always happens. Then, of course, you got to go back and make sure you've seeded things properly, and so that the reader finds it convincing the way you've
So
developed your story.
so how long does it take from, when you first get the nub of an idea and you sit down to start to write, how long does it take to get that first draft down where it's somewhat coherent?
3 to 4 months.
Of
But then,
how many hours a day?
I don't write that much in the morning, maybe 1 to 2 hours.
Okay.
I'll try and just do one scene or one chapter, because I found that if I push to do more, I'm just pushing to a right. I don't really have anything to say. I'm too exhausted. I mean, I'm
Right.
an old man, John. I'm an old man.
Well,
I
speak for
get tired
yourself.
easily.
Well, do you set any kind of a word count goal?
No, I mean, well, I always think I've done well if I get like between 1,000 and 2,000 words down.
Okay.
And that's usually it will involve one scene. It's not enough for a chapter usually, but it's a scene. And I think, okay, good. Now I know I got that done. Kind of know where direction it's heading in, which helps. And then I try and do it each morning. But if I don't, maybe I don't have any idea what to do. But at least then the rest of the day, I'll have it working in my mind. I can be thinking, okay, now, I really got to get this guy back in there, or this is only makes sense if he goes here next, something like
Mhm.
that.
Now,
So even if you're not writing, you're thinking about it.
exactly. And one of the things I tell my writing students, suggest to them, and I'd be interested to see if this is good advice. After you've written, your first draft, my
Mhm.
suggestion is to go back and read it all the way through and resist the temptation to dive in immediately and start fixing everything, but to read it in its totality to see how it lives up to what your gold standard is of a good book. Is that the way you approach it? Am I giving good advice or bad advice?
I think you're giving good advice. Unfortunately, I don't follow it. But that
Well,
makes a lot of sense.
you do all right. Don't listen to me, folks. Listen to Bill.
No, 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 no. I think that makes a lot of sense because that'll give you a better impression of how things fit together, and
Mhm.
because you could start, if you do what I do, you make some corrections in the early chapters, and as you're going along, you're thinking, no, wait a minute, that doesn't work. I've got to go back and do it all over again. Um, so, but I just can't resist the temptation, and I
Right.
generally have an idea when I get on, where I need to rework a scene, or where there's a weak spot, something like that. So I think, and I've got my biggest problem, and I think taking your approach would help here, is remembering what characters are doing what and how they were first introduced. And so I
Right.
have to, that's one of the things. And that's where I think the closest I come to being a plotter is to, write some of those names down on a pad of paper so that I remember which ones I need to check. Who did that? How did that one come in there? I've got one guy in the novel I'm working on now. He's a former thug, and he's a lawyer for this one mob boss or former mob boss. And I can't for the life of me remember how I first introduced him. So I got to go find that when I go back.
Yeah. How many, at what point do you bring beta readers in, or do you?
I don't actually. I have not. Actually, my wife does a lot. Will read the manuscripts through. She is also has had a lot of editing experience, and she goes over them pretty well, and she does a lot of fact checking. She's always pausing for a second. I see her looking stuff up, checking out things. So she keeps me honest.
Daunting. That's got to be scary when she's doing something like that, right?
Well, yeah. I mean, but it's I've convinced her that some of the things might not be grammatical, but that's intentional. When on dialogue and things like that. But she's that. Believe me, that really helps. And I've always asked her, "Is this hanging together? Does this make sense? These characters real enough?" And have I done that? And she'll say, "Yeah, generally, most of the time." So that's really one of my first readers. And then depending on the story, I'll send it off to somebody. For instance, the Simon in Saigon, I gave that to a high school classmate of mine who served in Vietnam. Now, he didn't serve in 1964. I'm old, but not that old. However, I just said, is this capture things like the whole scene in Saigon, and the weather and that kind of, he says, oh yeah, you got the weather right. That's for damn sure. And what the American military was up to and that kind of stuff. The Prague Spring I showed to that former colleague who had served and lived and served in Prague. So in that sense, I'll have a beta reader, but it'll vary from story to story.
So how many drafts does it go through before it's ready for prime time? For
me, usually 5, 6, and then I'll do at least 4 or 5 at home before I send it off to have anybody look at it to the publisher. Then my publisher will often require some revisions, not wholesale, but it's like, well, Bill, you got to clarify this scene more. Not everybody's going to have read the previous books, this kind of thing. You got to, or this isn't clear. It's too confusing. You got all these people talking here in this scene, and you don't know who's doing what and things like that. So there'll be sort of spot changes, and so that and that I'll go back and forth with the publisher 2 or 3 times before they're happy with what I've done.
When you first started writing fiction, what kind of expectation did you have for what the process was going to be like? And now that you're an accomplished spy novelist, what is the reality? How did the expectation compare to what the reality is now?
I expected more input and more demands for revisions from the publisher and the editors with the publisher. And it's been quite light, and I'm surprised. And early on, I was actually disappointed that the copy line editors weren't heavier, because before my wife started reading the manuscripts, there were a lot of mistakes and typos that got through. I sort of assumed that they would catch everything. That's their job, Well, they don't.
Mm-hmm.
So you really do need to go over it. And that's where the computer has really helped with a little red underline, and
mm-hmm,
you're missing stuff.
The other, and then go ahead, keep going. No, you.
I was just going to say the other thing that surprised me is how, since I don't have one of the big 5 or big time publishers, it's Epicenter Coffeetown Press it's a small house outside Seattle. They don't do much promotional stuff. You really have to do all that yourself. Was
that a surprise? That was a surprise.
Yeah. In some ways it's enjoyable, because you go to these writers conferences and you meet folks like we've met at the writers conferences, and you can, network, and you get to engage with readers, which is very enjoyable. I really like doing, book signings at bookstores, and the Northern Virginia Christmas market has been a boon. It's great. I just sell piles of books at that thing, and you end up engaging with people and discussing your books and whatnot. And new aspiring writers will always come up to you and ask about, what do you recommend and what would you do? And could you read this for me? And this sort of thing. So
Mhm.
that's actually, it's kind of a disappointment, but there's a positive element to that as well.
Uh-huh, uh-huh. Um, what advice do you have for wannabe writers? Things that you wish you'd known when you started out?
I think the importance of developing your own voice, unique voice. I tell
What
people
does
that,
that mean? What does that mean?
it's the how you tell your story, how you use your prose to tell your story, and using your POV. I tell people that. Well, first thing I tell them is you got to read. You got to read a lot, and the benefit there is you're going to find styles that you like, that you think are emulating, but you got to be careful because you have to develop your own voice and as a storyteller. And reading will give you some sense of how to go about that. But it's easy to fall into a trap where you just want to imitate somebody. I think the first early versions of my private eye novels, I'm reading and I'm thinking, oh, this guy, he wants to be a Raymond Chandler wannabe. I mean, that's
Mhm.
he's got to develop some independence from that. But there are elements there that you admire and you think are sort of classical, and so you want to you find a way to reflect that without imitating it. And I tell people that's what publishers are looking for. I think for a unique and independent voice, and it's you're right in asking what that means, because it's hard to explain. But I think it's just how you developed your craft as an independent and unique storyteller.
What is it you're working on now? I think you referred to something. It's another one of the PI
The
novels.
PI novels, yeah. I wasn't really thinking about going back to it. In fact, if anything, some other writers have said, "Oh, you got to, you're Karl Bayer, your spy, and that Stasi officer at the end of the Prague Spring. They developed this kind of cooperative relationship, but where's that going to go? And are they simply trying to exploit each other?" And I was kind of thinking about that a little bit. I don't really have a crisis in mind. Karl Bayer always had this tremendous career where he always found himself assigned to a major crisis, which
Uh-huh.
does wonders for your career. But in any sense, but then something happened here in the town of Naperville. My wife and I noticed that there was a helicopter sort of station flying nearby. And it turns out they discovered a car at the bottom of one of these retaining ponds. And it had been down there for 22 years. And there was a corpse in the driver's seat. And they pulled
Hmm.
that up. And I thought, and she said, maybe that would be a good story for Bill Haberman to investigate. And I thought, yeah, I guess so. I guess it would. So I just started fooling around with her writing it. And I thought, this is kind of fun. And normally, John, I don't know about you, but normally when I'm thinking I got to write I'm thinking, oh crap, I got to write. I got to get up and write today. Maybe I should rearrange my sock drawer or something, or whatnot. But this one, it hasn't felt that way. It's been fun because it's been, unlike the spy novels are third person narratives, the private eye novels are first person narratives, like Chandler,
Right,
would write.
right.
And so I think that's a little easier for me to do, because it's more part of yourself and you have fun having the character reflect and swear and be a wise ass and whatnot.
There's
But I
there's a
think,
there's an anecdote. There's an anecdote I can tell you that happened in
uh-huh,
Chicago. One of the
yeah,
guys I used to work with was a news director at a TV station in Chicago, and he was a writer for me in Atlanta. And he told me the story. This is sort of like the stupid questions journalists ask. Maybe
hmm,
you've even heard the story, or you might even be able to use it in the one you're writing now. It's a
uh-huh,
story about there was a car found in the Chicago River, and they hoisted it out, opened the trunk, and in the back there's a bullet riddled body, and he's wrapped up in chains, bound, gagged, handcuffed. And one of the television reporters asked the cops were giving a news
hmm.
conference, and one of the reporters said, "Is foul play suspected?" And without batting an eye, the guy said, "It's the damnedest case of suicide we've ever seen." You have my permission to use that.
All right, I'll see some variation on that. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
that might be
You
fun. Yeah,
can
you
you
stick it up early because there's all you have are questions. It's been 22 years. What kind of evidence is going to be available? So
Yeah,
yeah,
exactly.
maybe we could play with that one. Yeah.
So
So,
what have I not asked that you'd like to address?
oh gosh, um, the only thing I think is one of the reasons what I hope the Cold War series does. There's sort of a backstory here. The United States, we had been an isolationist power. After the First World War, we really were a world power now, but we didn't want to accept the responsibility that required, or the commitments. And that was over. In 45, we realized we had to step in, had to construct this new post-war order, which created untold, unexperienced prosperity for the world, and also, the furtherance of democratic governance. And I think, but it was something new for us. And the agency was brand new. 47, Truman was told that while Bill Donovan recommended holding on to the OSS, and Truman said, we don't need a Gestapo. That was the American mind. That's what you equated with a security service, So it was brand new. So both our role as world leader and the agency's role as an intelligence organization with a very specific role in government were all brand new, and we had to learn as we went along. And I think that's kind of what's in the backdrop there. And we made a lot of mistakes. The Brits helped, but also kind of manipulated us at times, like in Iran. And I think it's, that's one of the things that I hope a reader can get a sense of, is that this is new. These are people trying to do their best. They're still, in many ways, they say generals generally fight the last war when they start a new one. Well, I think that explained a lot of what the agency was up to. They were thinking about how the OSS went to war against the Nazis, and we had to do the same thing in the Cold War against the Soviet Union, but it was a whole different game. And we had to learn as we went along.
How can people get in touch with you? We didn't have a chance to set this up ahead of time. So if you tell me what the best way people can, through your website or an email address, I'll type it in and throw it up on the screen.
Sure. The website, it's www.billrappsbooks, all one word, BILLRAPPSBOOKS.com. That's the website.
Let me hold on just a second. I'm going to save that, and I'm going to put that up on the screen. And you can be my proofreader. www.billrappsbooks.com. What's that? Oh, you can.
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah.
Okay.
And then I think an email that people can use is it's my one daughter put together this when I went to Iraq. They were just starting to do things like Sky and Skype and Zoom and whatnot. And so she put together an email address for me, and it's I'll have spell it out. It's
okay.
BILLIAM
Bill, I am. Bill, I'm sorry.
Yeah, the combination of Bill and William. So it's BILLIAMRAPP7 at gmail.com.
All right, hold on. At gmail.com. Billiam Rapp 7 at gmail.
Billiam Rapp 7.
Okay.
Yeah, gmail.com. The 7 is in there because she was a hockey player. And when she started playing on this one AAA team, she says, I need a number for my jersey. And I said, well, Julia, it has to be 7 because that was Mickey Mantle's number.
There you go.
My hero when I was growing up.
Same here.
And she kept that 7 for every team she played for right up through college. So that's it. That's why the 7 is there.
Okay. Well, and I liked Yogi Berra. Yogi Berra was 8, but that's okay.
Oh, yeah.
That's so
the great philosopher.
Right. What time is it? You mean now? BilliamRapp7 at gmail.com and
that's correct.
BillRappsBooks.com. Mm-hmm. This has been tremendous. What's the next conference I'm going to see you at?
I've registered for Killer Nashville. If you're going to be there,
I'll be there.
We're usually down there. Yeah,
I am.
I'll see you at that one. I'm hoping to make C3. I don't know if I can do it this year. I'm discovering that these conferences are expensive, real expensive. So
I know, I know. I'm having to cut back myself, but you're absolutely right. It's a great way to meet people, especially people who are more advanced than you are, farther along in the process.
yeah.
The bar is where it happens, and
Mhm.
great place to to meet and talk with people. This has been so much fun, and we've been talking with Bill Rapp, a Cold War spy novelist, former CIA official, generous with his time and his talent. Bill, this has been tremendous. Thanks very much.
Thank you, John. I've thoroughly enjoyed this, and I'm really glad we finally got around to doing this. And I think it's a great program you've got going here, and I think
Thank you.
it's a big help, a real help to authors.
Thank you. To be continued, sir.
To be continued. Yeah. Okay.